All right, everyone. Let's pick up where we left off. Last time we talked about why Dawkins calls evolution a theorem, a scientific fact. Today, we're looking at why it took humanity so long to figure it out and how we can see evolution happening right in our own backyards. Dawkins argues that we were held back for centuries by what he calls the dead hand of Plato. See, Plato was all about essentialism. To an essentialist, there's an ideal version of a rabbit or a dog hanging out in conceptual space, and every real animal is just a flawed deviation from that perfect form. But evolution is the exact opposite. It's population thinking. There is no perfect rabbit, only a shifting cloud of variable bunnies that change over time. To help us wrap our heads around this, Dawkins gives us the hairpin thought experiment. Imagine you take a female rabbit and stand her next to her mother. Then put the grandmother next to her, and keep going back in time for millions of years. As you walk down that line, you'd never notice a single generation that wasn't a rabbit. But eventually, you'd reach a hairpin bend, a common ancestor. If you turn around and walk forward in time toward a different branch, like leopards, you'd slowly see those shrew-like ancestors turn into something like a stoat, then eventually a leopard. There was never a rabipard, just a long chain of mothers and daughters who all looked like their own species. Now, how does this change actually happen? Dawkins calls it sculpting the gene pool. He uses the example of artificial selection, breeding. Think about the wild wolf. In just a few centuries, humans used selective breeding to turn wolves into everything from a Great Dane to a Chihuahua. We aren't literally carving the dog's flesh. We're carving the gene pool by choosing which genes get passed on. He mentions a really cool concept called neoteny. Have you ever noticed that a pug's face looks kind of like a puppy that never grew up? That's because breeders selected for genes that keep infantile proportions. But here's where it gets really interesting. Humans weren't the first breeders. Dawkins argues that insects were the first domesticators. Long before humans were around, bees and butterflies were breeding flowers to be bright, showy, and full of nectar. The plant pays the insect and nectar for the service of flying its pollen to another flower. This created an evolutionary arms race for specialization. Dawkins and Alfred Russel Wallace even used this logic to make a famous prediction. They saw a Madagascar orchid with a nectar tube 11 inches deep and predicted there must be a moth with an 11-inch tongue to pollinate it. Decades later, scientists found it, the predicta moth. Finally, Dawkins brings us to the big one, natural selection. He uses the anglerfish as a bridge. The anglerfish has a little lure that looks like a worm to attract prey. The small fish that get tricked are essentially choosing which anglerfish survive and breed, but they're choosing with their lives. This leads to a world of trade-offs. In nature, nothing is free. For example, a rat could evolve thicker, stronger teeth, but it would have to pay for that with the calcium needed for its bones or milk. Nature is constantly scrutinizing every tiny variation, rejecting the bad and preserving the good. Dawkins leaves us with this thought. If humans can turn a wolf into a Pekingese in just a few centuries, imagine what nature can do with 46 million centuries. If you extrapolate that change over billions of years, it becomes a lot easier to see how a fish could eventually become a human. Next time, we'll talk about the clocks scientists use to prove just how old the Earth really is.
All right, everyone, let's settle in. We've spent some time talking about the broad strokes of the debate between Richard Dawkins and Jonathan Sarfati, but today we're going to get into the biological nuts and bolts of their disagreement. To give you some context, Dawkins' book The Greatest Show on Earth argues that natural selection is an almost magical, creative force that built all life from a single cell. Sarfati's rebuttal, The Greatest Hoax on Earth, argues that Dawkins is actually attacking a straw man by proving things that creationists already believe, while ignoring the massive problems that stop particles-to-people evolution in its tracks. 1. Natural selection, the chisel versus the creator. First, let's clear up a huge misconception. People often think Darwin invented natural selection. In reality, Creationist scientists like Edward Blythe were writing about it decades before Darwin. Creationists view natural selection as a conservative force, not a creative one. Sarfati uses a great analogy. Natural selection is like a sculptor's chisel. A sculptor makes a statue by removing stone, not by adding it. In the same way, natural selection chisels genes out of the gene pool. Take the classic example of dog fur. Imagine an ancestral wolf-like pair with genes for both long, L, and short, S, fur. They have medium fur. If their descendants move into a freezing Arctic environment, only the pups that happen to inherit two long genes, LL, will survive. Within a few generations, you have a specialized breed of long-furred dogs. And here's the kicker, they have lost the information for short fur. They are more specialized, but they are genetically poorer and less able to adapt if the climate warms up again. Evolution requires an increase in information, but natural selection only ever involves sorting or losing it. 2. The information hurdle. This brings us to the core of the debate. Information. To turn a microbe into a microbiologist, you need to add massive amounts of new genetic instructions, code for eyes, brains, and complex immune systems. Dawkins points to beneficial mutations as the engine for this growth, but Sarfati argues that beneficial doesn't mean information adding. Think about wingless beetles on a windy island. Not being able to fly is a benefit because they won't get blown into the sea, but they got that benefit by breaking the genes for wings. Or look at sickle cell anemia. It protects people from malaria, but it does so by destroying a useful oxygen carrier. In every case we observe, beneficial changes are almost always downhill, not the uphill climb evolution needs. 3. Kinds versus species. Now, let's talk about Noah's Arkansas. You'll often hear skeptics ask, how did Noah fit millions of species on a boat? Sarfati says this is another equivocation. The Bible doesn't use the word species, it uses the word kind, the Hebrew word min. A kind is much broader than a modern species. For example, a lion, a tiger, and a house cat might all be part of the same original cat kind. This means Noah only needed a few thousand animals, not millions. After the flood, these kinds spread out and rapidly split into the many species we see today through natural selection and isolation. Dawkins often treats speciation, the formation of new species, as proof of evolution. But since creationists have taught for centuries that one kind can produce many species, proving speciation happens doesn't actually disprove the Bible. It fits the creationist orchard model perfectly. 4. The edge of evolution. To see if these changes can go far enough to support Dawkins' theory, we have to look at the math. Sarfati brings in biochemist Michael Behe, who studied malaria to find the edge of what mutation can do. Because there are trillions of malarial parasites with very short life cycles, they are like a high-speed lab for evolution. Behe found that for malaria to develop resistance to the drug chloroquine, it requires two specific mutations to happen at the same time. This is incredibly rare. If a simple change like that takes so much time in a massive population of parasites, how long would it take for a human-like ancestor to evolve? According to Behe's math, any adaptation requiring two or more coordinated mutations would never happen in the human lineage, even in millions of years. 5. Haldane's dilemma and genetic decay. Finally, we have the speed limit problem. This is called Haldane's dilemma. Even under the most favorable conditions, it takes a long time for a new beneficial mutation to spread through a population because everyone who doesn't have it has to die off. This is the cost of substitution. Calculations show that in the supposed 10 million years since humans and chimps split, we could have only substituted about 1,700 beneficial mutations. Is that enough to explain the tripling of brain size, upright walking, and the invention of language? Most geneticists say no, not by a long shot. And it gets worse. While we are waiting for one good mutation to spread, hundreds of near-neutral, bad mutations are piling up in our DNA like rust on a car. This is called genetic entropy. Dr. John Samford argues that natural selection isn't strong enough to stop these tiny typos from accumulating. If the human race were really millions of years old, we should have suffered genetic meltdown and gone extinct a long time ago. The fact that we are still here, suggests a much younger genome. Conclusion. So, here's the summary of the hoax versus the show. Dawkins sees natural selection as a creative force building a tree of life. Sarfati sees it as a conservative force managing a forest, or orchard, of created kinds. Dawkins emphasizes millions of years for change. Sarfati points to mathematical limits and genetic decay that make those millions of years a death sentence for species, not a workshop. The question for you to consider as you study these sources is this: does the evidence show life climbing upward toward more complexity, or is it a story of life chiseling down into specialized, but genetically depleted varieties? All right, that's our deep dive for today. Make sure to review the section on information theory for our next quiz. Class dismissed.